Hi everyone. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so YouTube keeps showing you more content like this. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, let's begin. I arrived in Juni on Wednesday, 8 March 2023, at 4:26 p.m. after a long drive inland from Wagga Wagga. The thermometer on the dash read 31 degrees. A dry northerly crosswind pushed dust along the shoulders of the Olympic Highway in little tan funnels that broke apart when trucks hammered past. The sky was a hard blue, without a cloud in it, and the heat snapped off the bonnet when I stepped out to stretch. Juni itself looked the way small Australian towns do in late summer, when the school day is done and the bakery has sold the last of the sausage rolls. Tin roofs flashing, wide verges where the grass had given up. Kids on beaten BMX bikes drifting like birds from shade to shade. I checked into a room at the motel on Crawley Street because I liked the coincidence of the name even before I really thought about why it rang a bell. The room smelled faintly of eucalyptus cleaner and old carpet. A moth had gotten itself trapped between the window and the gauze fly screen and tapped the mesh with slow patience, while I set my bag on the bed and read the laminated emergency exit plan out of a habit I pretend is professional and not nerves. I was in town to do a quick 2-day feature on the Juni Roundhouse Railway Museum for a transport magazine, the kind of human interest piece about men with hands like spanners and locomotives that still breathe coal dust when nobody is looking. It was extra work on the side, and I told myself a side visit to the big house on the hill would be a gift to my curiosity rather than the main event. That was easy to believe before the sun went down. At 5:12 p.m., I walked to the main street for a pie and a cold lemon squash. The heat leaked out of the bitumen in waves that smelled faintly of tar and sunburned leaves. 2 older women sat on a bench outside the post office with bags of groceries at their feet and watched me the way towns watch strangers without malice, just an accounting. When I asked for directions to the homestead, the woman with the straw hat said, without needing to hear the full question, that it was at the top of the rise past the showground, that tours ran in the evening some nights, and then she said that the gate looks closer than it is when you stand in the dust. Her friend nudged her and changed the subject to the price of milk. I ate on the verge under a brittle peppercorn tree and told myself I would go up for a photograph before dark and come back for the tour the next night like a sane person. It felt like a plan an adult would make. The air trembled with heat from the road, and in that quiver, the hill seemed to lean a little nearer than it had a minute before. At 6:03 p.m., I set off up the hill with my camera and a bottle of water and the kind of apology you make to your own knees when you have been sitting all day. The first thing that surprised me was the wind changing. The northerly fell away as if someone closed a door behind me, and a thinner breeze came from the east with a faint metallic taste. Not blood, not pennies. Something like the corner of a shed where the galvanized sheets have warmed all day. The second thing was how quiet the insects became. You never notice the hum until it thins. By the time I reached the showground, the light was turning from white to the pale yellow of old paper. The homestead sits up there like a command. Wide verandas and a symmetry that looks harmless in photographs and much less so with the dry grass speaking under your boots. The gate was closed and chained. A simple chain you could lift if you had long fingers and no sense. Someone had hung an iron ring on the post at hand height. An old hitching point maybe, smooth from years of palms. I laid 2 fingers on it without thinking and flinched. It was warm in a way that did not match the air. Not hot enough to burn, just the remembered heat of a hand that had let go a moment ago. A raven cawed from the fig tree near the house, and I saw, for the first time, that the windows on the upper floor were a shade darker than they should have been in that light, as if someone had drawn a tinted film across them. No lights were on. The sun had another 20 minutes in it at least. Still, there was a quality behind the glass like a room where a fire has recently been, and the heat is slower to leave than the people. I stood at the gate longer than I meant to, long enough for my bottle to sweat through my palm and leave a ring on the chalky dust. Somewhere behind the house came a sound like a horse shifting in a stall. Not a whinny, not a lonely movie noise, just the close damp thump of a hoof coming down and the rasp of a bit against teeth. I told myself a property this big would have horses. The chain on the gate pressed lightly against the post, as if something had leaned against it from inside. The most nothing movement in the world, and then the breeze came back, and the chain tapped metal, and I told myself every sensible thing I know, and walked back down the hill with my camera in my pocket. The motel owner was sitting behind the counter reading the paper when I came in. His name tag said D. Harrison in neat black letters. He looked at my red face and said I could have saved myself the climb, because tours were tomorrow and Saturday only. Then asked if I had enjoyed the view. I said it was bigger than I expected, and he made a noise that could have been agreement or could have been the end of the conversation. When I told him I thought I heard a horse, he put the paper down and looked up slowly in a way that reminded me of the way my father looked up from the radio when he was deciding if a story from the news deserved to be spoken out loud. He said there were no horses up there anymore, not for years, and then said that sounds carries strange on hot nights, and that if I wanted breakfast I should put my name on the list by 9, because the toaster hates late sleepers. In my room I showered and the water left the smell of chlorine in my hair. The window let in a square of highway noise, and the slow creak of a sign somewhere in the night. I slept harder than I meant to, and woke at 2:19 a.m., with my heart making itself known against the mattress. The room was dark and the air conditioner had clicked off. I do not know what woke me. There was no thunder. There was no door closing. There was just a faint intermittent glow against the ceiling like light from a fire somewhere far away. The way the sky goes orange on a bad night in summer miles from the flame. When I sat up, the glow thinned to nothing and the moth between the window and the screen thumped once against the mesh without direction and was quiet. On Thursday, I did my interviews at the Roundhouse and took photographs of men in navy shirts standing beside one another without quite touching, men whose faces only softened when they put a hand on old iron. There is a particular smell in sheds like that, and if you know it, you never forget it. Hot oil and the dust that rises from timber when a blade goes dull. I ate lunch in the shade and watched heat shiver above the rails. And when the day cooled, I walked up the hill again with a night tour ticket in my pocket and an intention to be ordinary that felt honest. There was a group of 8 of us outside the gate at 7:03 p.m. when a woman in a black polo with the homestead name embroidered on it came down with a set of keys. She introduced herself as Louise. She had a notebook in her hand and the kind of tired smile people who run tourist sites wear after summer holidays end, and they still have to soft step around every story to keep the air right. She unchained the gate and said they had the usual rules: no climbing barricades, no wandering off, no leaning on balcony rails, and if anyone felt unwell to say so. The iron ring on the post near my shoulder felt cooler tonight, but sticky, as if a hand had sweated on it, and the skin oil had not yet given up to dust. Louise led us up the drive. The gravel was new enough that it squeaked under our shoes, and the sound made the hairs on my arms rise. In the last light, the house faces you the way some men do, taking your measure without blinking. Inside it was cooler. The cedar smelled like old money and sadness. The long hall held photographs of people in stiff clothes, who looked as if they had not quite accepted the idea of being captured by a lens. One frame held a family whose faces had been touched by light so many times they had softened into a blur and only the eyes remained sharp. Another showed a horse and boy near a stable door. The boy's hair parted with a ruler, the horse's ears pricked toward something outside the frame. Louise's voice stayed steady as she talked about architecture and the dates nobody argues about, and the dates everybody does. She did not seem like a woman who wanted to sell us a fright. Twice she coughed and said local dust always got her in March. In the dining room a couple held hands, and the woman asked in a careful tone whether the stories about a maid were true. Louise said that versions exist, and that this was a house like any other house, where tragedy flared and then sat quietly at the table for decades. Somewhere deeper in the house, a door opened and closed, with the slow fall of a thing that has been hung straight for a long time. Nobody moved. When the noise did not come again, Louise smiled and said old timber hates the shift from day to night as much as bones do, and led us on. The upstairs smelled warmer. That was the first thought I had, that the air had a body temperature in it that did not come from up. The carpet on the landing gave a little under my shoe. A ceiling fan ticked on a low setting, the kind of tick that is pleasant when you are lying under it with your eyes closed, and an irritant when you cannot work out what is different about it. We paused by a door with a brass knob, polished bright from a century of hands. Louise said we could step through one by one to look at the balcony. No leaning, and the man with the handhold squeezed tighter. When it was my turn, I stepped past her shoulder and the first breath of outside air touched my face. It smelled like hot metal cooling and dry grass. The balustrade ran hip-high and smooth. The yard below was a chalk sketch of itself in moonlight. On the distant road, a truck sounded its engine as it hit the rise, and then the night took the noise back until you could hear your own tongue move when you swallowed. From the shadow of the fig tree came a soft shift like weight redistributing on old timber. A horse changing feet, if you have spent any time around horses. A man behind me said quietly that he did not want to be out here anymore, and Louise put a hand on his elbow and brought him in without a word. The door closed without slamming, and the fan ticked again. 2 beats, then a pause. In the smaller bedroom at the back, Louise asked us to keep clear of the fireplace because the brickwork had been repaired only recently. When I stood near it anyway to take a photograph over the heads of the others, my forearm prickled with heat, the way it does when you stand too close to a barbecue. There were no coals. The bricks looked cold to the touch. I did not touch them. On the mantel, a tin matchbox sat open with 3 blue-headed matches inside. 2 new for the rest of the room. A child in our group, a boy of about 8 in a t-shirt with a dirt bike on it, pointed at the matches and said to his mother that there was smoke in his nose. His mother told him he was being silly and then sniffed the air and moved him quietly to the other side of her. Louise clasped her notebook in both hands and asked if anyone wanted tea before the last stretch of the tour. No one did, and we all said we did in the same breath, the way people will when they want the room changed without admitting it. In the kitchen the kettle sang, and the lights flickered once, as if someone wasted no patience on modern wiring. A framed news clipping by the door had gone sepia the way cheap paper does. I could not read the headline, but the grainy photograph was of a group of townspeople standing shoulder to shoulder in a stiff line, hats off, eyes tight. One man's jacket lapel was charred as if he had put a fire out with his chest. I am not someone who wanders off on tours. I make a point of being the person who stands where he is told. I do not like other people's insurance paperwork. When I found myself back in the hall after tea with my cup on the dresser, cooling as if it had been left there by someone else, it confused me in the dull way that becomes fright. A few seconds later, when your body catches up, I told myself I would go as far as the first door and step back before anyone noticed. The hall seemed to narrow slightly as I moved. It was not my imagination. Old houses pinch you. I passed one of the photographs and could have sworn the glare on the glass had warmed to the faintest orange. The small door under the back stairs was shut and the keyhole glinted. The air changed. From behind the door came the quick, sharp stamp of a hoof and the soft drag of something iron against teeth. It was such a well-formed sound that my brain did not have time to interpret it as anything but true before my body was moving back toward the kitchen at a very polite and adult pace that had nothing to do with the need to run. In the kitchen, Louise looked up and said that sometimes the plumbing groans, and I said that I do not know any plumber who shoes pipes, and she laughed and called me a smartass in a way that tried to dissolve whatever had gathered in my throat. The boy in the dirt bike shirt had his face pressed against his mother's side, as if listening to her stomach. His mother smoothed his hair with a quick hand and did not tell him to stop. The last room on the tour was the sitting room with the piano that had not been tuned in anyone's memory. The light in there felt wrong, not frightening, just as if someone had decided on a temperature and a brightness level that were correct for a different place and carried them in. Louise took us through the last set of dates and names. She asked if we had questions, and people did the thing groups do when it is time to be let go. They shook their heads all together, grateful and guilty. Outside, the fig leaves moved without wind and the crickets came back all at once. A switch thrown somewhere below the yard. On the walk down the drive, the gravel sang higher than it had on the way up, and the iron ring on the post snagged my sleeve with a touch so exactly like a human hand that my throat closed. I did not look back at the upper windows. I think about that choice a lot now. The chain fell into place with a clink that sounded like a small animal's teeth, and we said our soft good nights and our thanks, and walked our separate ways down into town with the road lights holding the sky up in square. Back in my room, I washed my face and the water left a smell on my skin like it had carried something through the pipes that did not belong to the motel. It took me an hour to sit with the recorder and my note. I do not always listen back immediately, but the heat on my forearm where I had stood near the cold fireplace had left a faint pink that would not fade, and my curiosity grew a thin edge. At 11:38 p.m., I played the first file from the hall. It was the usual noise, room tone, and the susurrus of bodies in a space that does not appreciate them. I marked the time code and moved on. When I cued the segment recorded near the back stairs, the waveform jumped before the sound did a single sharp vertical line, and then the clear stamp of a hoof, and the metal rasp, exactly as my ears had told me in the moment. Only behind that sound was another, as if the recorder had picked up a thing. The air round my head had not. It was a breath with a wooden quality, like a person breathing through a box. It came in on a count and held for a second too long, and went out with a soft cluck of tongue on tooth. My hand left sweat on the trackpad. I played it again and again until the sound and the shape of it were the same in my head, and the room, and then I shut the laptop firmly and put it under the chair as if it was something that could leak. I tell myself I slept after that. If I did, the sleep had the brittle quality of a pain under pressure. At 2:13 a.m. I woke with the precise knowledge that something heavy had just shifted in the corridor outside my door. The motel has cheap carpet. It makes a whisper when someone walks. What I heard was not a footstep. It was a single quiet pouring on the carpet, and the faintest jingle of a metal ring against a tooth. I said my name out loud in the way a person sometimes does when he needs to remember what it is. The corridor air smelled faintly of burnt sugar and hair singed on a hot plate. I did not open the door. In the morning there was nothing under it but a smear of tan dust. The wind had pushed there and the towel I put down for the draft. I ate breakfast and signed for my room and drove to the roundhouse for another hour with the men and their machines, and when I left town at 11:02 a.m., the sky had puckered with high cloud and a cooler breeze came from the south, with the promise of a late storm. Near the bottom of the hill I stopped at the bakery for a second pie for the road. The man at the counter looked at my notepad and asked if I had been up the big house. When I said I had, he nodded once and rang me up without asking what I had seen. As I turned to go, he said, not as a story but as a fact. He was tired of carrying that when his mother was a girl she was told never to stand at the gate for more than a minute, because the house decides eventually whether you belong inside the fence or out. And he tore the receipt off and handed it to me with a forced smile that missed his eyes. It was the middle of January 2019 when I first drove through the Pilliga Scrub. I remember the date exactly because I was heading back from Brisbane to Dubbo after my cousin's wedding, and I'd left it too late in the day. It was around 7:30 in the evening when I pulled onto the Newell Highway, and the sun had just disappeared below the horizon. The air was still holding that dry summer heat, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your back even though the windows are down. My phone's weather app said it was 34°P, And I believed it. The air was heavy with the smell of hot tar and eucalyptus. The Pilliga is the kind of place that everyone in New South Wales has heard of, even if they've never set foot there. 500,000 hectares of bushland, thick, unbroken scrub, stretching out in all directions. Locals call it a forest, but it doesn't look like the dark green forests you might imagine. It's dusty, tangled, full of twisted ironbarks and white cypress pine, with the occasional patch of sand that swallows footprints. I'd been warned more than once about stopping there at night. If you break down, stay in the car and wait for daylight, one of my uncles told me when I mentioned the route. He said it casually, but his eyes didn't match his tone. At first it was uneventful. The road was quiet. Just my headlights cutting two beams through the darkness, reflecting off the white posts along the highway. Every now and then, a kangaroo darted across the bitumen, forcing me to slow. The hum of my tires and the occasional thud of insects hitting the windshield were the only sounds. I had the radio on low, some AM talk station fading in and out of static. About an hour into the drive, the strange feeling began. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just that sense of pressure you get when someone stands behind you for too long. My rearview mirror showed nothing, except the road stretching back, vanishing into blackness. I told myself it was just the long drive, the heat, the fact that I was alone. But then I saw the first figure. It was quick. Just at the edge of my headlights, a shape stepped onto the shoulder of the road maybe 100 meters ahead, human-sized, too upright to be an animal. My foot lifted off the accelerator, my stomach tightening, but before I could slow more, it was gone. Not jumped back into the bush, not crossed the road, just gone. I muttered, "What the hell?" and shook my head, telling myself it was a trick of light, the way shadows play in the scrub. I'd heard truckers tell stories like that, figures that appear on the road, vanish before you hit them. They laughed when they told it, like it was just a campfire tale. I wasn't laughing. A few kilometers later, I noticed the smell, damp, like rotting leaves after rain. Though the land was bone dry, it seemed to seep into the car, clinging to my nostrils no matter how wide I rolled the window. Then the voices began. At first I thought it was my radio, a woman's voice, faint, threading between the static. I leaned closer, squinting at the dial, but the station was almost gone. I turned it off. The voice didn't stop. It was coming from outside. "Hey," a whisper, soft, almost playful. It sounded close, as if someone were jogging alongside the car, matching my speed. I jerked my head left, then right. Nothing but trees and shadows whipping past. My skin prickled. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. I told myself out loud, "It's nothing, you're tired." Hearing my own voice was a relief, but it didn't drown out hers. "Stop. Stop the car." Clearer now, like she was leaning through the window. I slammed the radio back on, just to drown it out, twisting the volume until the static was screaming. My pulse thumped in my ears. I didn't dare slow down. The worst part came about 40 minutes in. That was when I saw the eyes, high in the trees to my left. Not a reflection from an animal low to the ground, but yellow eyes, spaced wide apart, at least 8 or 9 feet up. They followed my car. I know how that sounds. I thought maybe it was 2 owls, sitting close together on a branch. That had to be it. But they moved, sliding through the trees at the same speed I drove, always keeping up, always just at the edge of my vision. I said aloud, "No, no, no, no." My voice cracked. I wanted to stop, to turn the car round, but my uncle's warning kept ringing in my head. Don't stop in the scrub, not even for a flat tire. The last 20 kilometers felt endless. The smell grew worse, thick and sour, like a dead animal baking in the heat. My stomach rolled. The whispers turned into laughter, childlike, high-pitched giggles that ran along both sides of the car, weaving in and out of the insect thuds on the windshield. And then, without warning, it stopped. The smell, the voices, the eyes, everything. The silence pressed against my eardrums. I realized then that I'd been crying. Tears streaked my face, soaking into my shirt. When the first lights of Narrabri appeared ahead, my whole body went weak. I pulled into a servo on the edge of town and sat there in the bright fluorescent glow, hands shaking so badly I couldn't get the fuel cap open. The attendant came out, a stocky bloke in a blue work shirt, and gave me a once-over. "Long drive through the Pilliga?" he asked. I nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't smile. He just said, "You made the right call not stopping." Then he filled the tank for me without another word. I didn't tell him about the woman's voice, or the eyes in the trees. I didn't tell anyone, not for a long time, but I've avoided that stretch of highway ever since. I take the long way now, even if it adds hours to the trip. People still go missing in that scrub. Bushwalkers, campers, the occasional unlucky driver. Their tracks end mid-step in the sand, like they just stopped existing. And sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I hear her whisper again, soft, patient, waiting. "Stop the car." It was late autumn when I first set foot in Port Arthur, Tasmania. The exact date is etched in my memory, May 12, 2022. The sky had been grey all day, the kind of dull, heavy grey that presses down on you until you feel small beneath it. I remember the smell of damp leaves and salt from the sea drifting through the town, a smell that clung to my jacket even after I left. I had been touring Tasmania on my own, just a short holiday, and Port Arthur had always been on my list. A place layered with history, tragedy, and rumour. The locals had warned me casually in the cafe earlier that afternoon, "Don't go there after dark. Some things don't sleep." They said it with a chuckle, the way you'd joke about a campfire story, but I noticed the way the barista avoided eye contact as she slid me my change. I booked a night tour anyway. By the time the group gathered at the visitors' centre, the rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy, the grass glistening with a wet shine beneath the lights. There were maybe a dozen of us tourists with jackets zipped high, cameras in hand, and a guide holding a lantern that flickered more than it glowed. He had that calm, rehearsed voice you'd expect, telling us about the penal colony, about the men who'd been forced to live in silence so strict they forgot how to speak, about the ones who lost their minds in the dark stone cells. As we walked, the gravel crunched underfoot and the wind moved in low sighs through the trees. The buildings loomed ahead in shadows, their broken windows catching the lantern light like dull eyes. I tried to stay close to the group, but I kept glancing off to the sides. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way the night pressed so thickly around us. Maybe it was the quiet, that strange hollow quiet that wasn't complete silence, but more like the absence of living things. When we stopped at the separate prison, I felt it immediately. The guide opened the heavy door, and the air that came out was cold and stale, like stone soaked with centuries of breath. Inside, the lantern light barely touched the edges of the narrow hallways. The cells lined each side, square holes with iron doors. I ran my hand lightly over one wall, feeling how the stone seemed to sweat in the dark. The guide explained how the convicts were kept here in complete silence, some locked for weeks, months, until they broke. He said you could still hear scratching sometimes if you pressed your ear to the walls. He laughed after saying it, but no one else did. I don't know why I lingered when the group moved on. I told myself it was curiosity, but the truth is, I thought I heard something, a faint, dragging sound, like fingernails on stone. I stepped closer to one of the open cells and stood just at the threshold. My breath was shallow, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Inside it was black. I squinted, but the dark swallowed everything. Then I heard it again just once, a scrape so faint, I might have convinced myself it was my own jacket brushing the wall. "Hey, you coming?" a man from the group called back. His voice broke the moment, sharp against the quiet. I nodded quickly and jogged to catch up, forcing a laugh, as if I hadn't felt my chest tighten. The rest of the tour blurred by in pieces. The chapel, the guard tower, the ruins, lit by the occasional lantern glow. I tried to keep focused on the guide's voice, but something in me felt stretched thin. My eyes kept catching movements in the corners, shadows that didn't seem tied to anyone. Once, as we crossed a courtyard, I thought I saw someone standing at the far end, motionless, facing us. I blinked, and the spot was empty, just wet grass and broken stone. By the time we reached the final stop, the old hospital, I was ready to leave. The building stood 2 stories high, its windows gaping open like missing teeth. The air was colder here, sharp enough to sting the nose. The guide told us how many prisoners died inside, how their bodies were stacked before burial. He paused dramatically, letting the silence hang, then gestured for us to follow him inside. I hesitated. The others shuffled forward, but my feet felt heavy, rooted. Something in the dark shape of the doorway felt wrong, as if stepping inside would mean something I couldn't undo. Then I felt it, a pressure against my back, like someone standing too close. I spun around, expecting to see one of the tourists, but the path behind me was empty, just the wind moving through the grass. "Don't fall behind," the guide said, his lantern already disappearing into the black moor of the hospital. I forced myself forward. Inside, the air was suffocating, thick with rot that shouldn't have lingered after all these years. The lantern light flickered against walls stained with age. I tried to stay in the middle of the group, but halfway down the hall I heard something again, not scraping this time, whispering, low, hushed, overlapping voices, like a prayer muttered by dozens of mouths at once. I froze, turning my head slowly toward the far end of the hall. There was nothing there, only the shifting darkness. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to the woman beside me. She shook her head quickly, eyes wide, as if she didn't want to talk about it. We reached the far end, and the guide stopped, telling some story I barely heard. My focus was on the shadows stretching along the floor. Shadows that seemed too long, too fluid, like they weren't tied to the people casting them. I kept my gaze down, but then something moved between the shadows, darting quick, like a small figure slipping from one wall to the other. That was when I felt the touch, cold fingers brushing the back of my neck, quick and deliberate. I spun around with a gasp, nearly dropping my phone, but again the hallway behind me was empty. My skin burned where I'd felt it. I didn't last much longer after that. The tour wrapped up, not long later, and I walked quickly back toward the visitor center with the others. But the whole time, I felt like someone was keeping pace with me, just out of sight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone trailing us, but there was only darkness and the shapes of ruined walls. When I finally reached my car, I sat behind the wheel for a long time, hands gripping it until my knuckles whitened. I could still hear it, the whispers, faint, like they had followed me out. I started the engine, headlights cutting through the mist, and drove away faster than I should have. I told myself it was just the power of suggestion, the stories, the atmosphere. But when I got back to my motel room that night, I pulled off my jacket and froze. There were streaks of grey stone dust on the shoulders, like someone with dirty hands had gripped me from behind. I never went back. But even now, sometimes when the room is quiet and the lights are low, I hear it again, that scraping sound, faint and patient, as if something that never learned how to stop is still trying to make itself heard. It was the winter of 2019 when I visited Fremantle, Western Australia. I had been traveling the coast for a couple of weeks, staying in small Airbnbs, mostly quiet places near the water where you could hear the wind rattle through the palm trees at night. Fremantle was different though. It was busy during the day, with its markets, pubs and murals splashed on the old limestone walls, At night, however, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Streets that had been filled with laughter and music just hours earlier fell into silence, so complete you could hear your own footsteps echo. Everyone I met said the same thing. Frio sleeps early because of the prison. The Fremantle prison is a UNESCO heritage site now, polished for tourists with guides carrying lanterns and neat brochures. They like to talk about history, the hard labor, the floggings, the hangings, but history has a way of bleeding through stone, and the prison's limestone walls have soaked up too much. People whispered about echoes that never belonged to them, about footsteps pacing the empty wings, lights flickering out in the exact spots where men had swung at the gallows. I didn't plan on taking the night tour. It wasn't really my thing, but the Airbnb host I stayed with, an older woman named Margaret, told me over breakfast that it was worth it if you want to feel Fremantle for what it really is. I remember her saying it without looking at me, buttering her toast with the kind of slow care people take when they don't want to meet your eyes. The night of the tour was cool, the kind of cold that clings to your sleeves and finds the space between your collar and your skin. The sky had that deep navy color that never fully turns black near the ocean. I joined a group of maybe 15 people at the gates, and the guide, a wiry man with a voice that carried too well, handed us each a small torch. He kept saying, "Stay close. Stay together. Don't wander." Inside, the prison smelled of dust and old salt. The limestone walls gave off a damp chill that seemed impossible for a place that had been dry for decades. Every sound, our footsteps, the click of torches being adjusted, was thrown back at us in sharp little echoes. I tried to stay near the back, away from the chatter of tourists. I wanted to feel the place as it was, not as a performance. The first strange thing happened in Division 4, one of the old cell blocks. We were all bunched together, the guide talking about how the cells had no toilets, just buckets, when I heard a distinct scrape, like someone dragging their fingernails across stone. It came from behind me, inside a cell we had already passed. I turned, shining my torch, but the room was empty. Just a bunk, a barred window, and a floor stained dark from 100 years of filth. The man beside me whispered, "Did you hear that?" His accent was Irish. I nodded. He shook his head and muttered, "Christ," like it was a prayer. We moved on, but I kept feeling eyes on me. Not the curious eyes of other tourists, but something lower, heavier, like being studied by someone with nothing better to do than wait. At the gallows chamber, the guide dimmed his lantern and let us stand in silence. The air felt wrong in that room. It was colder, for one, and it smelled faintly metallic, like rust or blood that never quite left. He told us stories of botched hangings, of bodies twitching for minutes when the rope hadn't been tied correctly. A woman near the front gagged, and her friend laughed nervously. I remember focusing on the beam overhead, the rope long gone but its shadow burned into the wall by a century of lanterns. That was when I felt it. A shove. Not hard enough to knock me down, but strong enough to make me step forward against my will. My torch swung wildly across the wall. I spun, expecting to see one of the group behind me, maybe playing a joke, but no one was there. They were all clustered in front, listening to the guide. I was standing alone at the back. I wanted to speak, to say something like, "Did anyone see that?" But my mouth felt dry, as if the air had been pulled straight out of me. I pressed myself against the wall until the guide moved us along. By the time we reached the solitary confinement cells, I was shaking. These were small rooms, darker than the rest, meant to crush a man's spirit in silence. The guide invited us to step inside one if we dared. A few people laughed and did so, shining their torches to prove their bravery. I didn't want to, but something made me glance into the nearest cell. That's when I saw him, just for a second. A man standing in the far corner, head bowed, hands at his sides. His skin was pale against the dark stone, his shirt loose and torn. My torchlight trembled, cutting across the wall, and when it steadied again the corner was empty. I stumbled back, colliding with the Irishman again. He gave me a look, his eyes wide, and whispered, "You saw it too, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The tour ended not long after. Everyone filed out, some laughing, some quiet. The guide gave us a cheery farewell, his voice breaking against the silence of the town. I walked back alone to Margaret's place. Fremantle's streets were deserted, the shop fronts shuttered, and even the gulls had gone quiet. I kept hearing footsteps behind me, time to mine but never quite in sync. When I got inside, Margaret was waiting up, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea. She looked at me carefully and asked, "Did you go?" I nodded. "Did it follow you?" she asked. I froze. "What do you mean?" She sighed, set her mug down and said, "The prison doesn't like to be forgotten. Some nights it lets people leave. Some nights it doesn't." I didn't sleep that night. The footsteps didn't stop. Not outside on the street. Not in the hallway of the house. Sometimes I swore I heard breathing right at the edge of my bed. By morning it was gone. I left Fremantle the next day, cutting my trip short. I told myself it was silly, that I was tired, that I had let a ghost tour get under my skin. But even now, years later, I still dream of that cell. I dream of the pale man standing in the corner, waiting. And sometimes, in the dead hours of the night when the world is quiet, I hear footsteps in my hallway. Not mine, not anyone's I know, just pacing, like someone biding their time, like the prison is still breathing through me. It was late autumn, November 12th, 2022. I remember the date clearly, because it was the day after my sister's birthday, and I had driven up from Newcastle to see her before heading further north. The weather was grey, that kind of flat sky that seems painted over with chalk, and there was a thin drizzle tapping the windshield as I made my way along the Pacific Highway. The air smelled of damp eucalyptus and burnt diesel from the trucks hauling down the road. I had been driving since early morning, my thermos of coffee long emptied, my throat dry and scratchy, when I saw the green sign, Kundabung Roadhouse, 1 kilometre. I'd heard the name before. Truckers on the CB chat always muttered about it in half-joking tones. "Don't stop in Kundabung after dark," one guy had once said, laughing in that nervous way people laugh when they don't want to explain themselves. At the time I dismissed it as road superstition, the kind of stories long-haul drivers share to pass the miles. But as the kilometers ticked down, my stomach grumbled and my gas gauge hovered low. I figured I'd risk it, if only for a hot coffee and a stretch of the legs. The roadhouse sat just off the highway, a squat rectangular building painted a faded cream color with a rusted tin roof. There were 2 fuel pumps under a flickering light, a diner-style cafe with big glass windows, and a convenience shop attached to the side. The car park was nearly empty, just one semi-trailer idling in the corner, its engine growling softly. I pulled in, killed the ignition and sat for a moment, listening. The drizzle pattered steadily on the roof, and beyond that was a kind of heavy stillness, as if the place had been pressed down into silence. Inside, the cafe was warmer than I expected, the air thick with the smell of fried food and burnt coffee. The floor was that sticky vinyl tile you find in old diners, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A woman in her 50s with curly blonde hair stood behind the counter flipping through a magazine. She gave me a quick glance when I walked in, but didn't say hello. "Coffee, please," I said, pulling out a $10 note. She poured it without a word, the dark liquid steaming into a chipped white mug. I tried to make small talk. asked how late they were open, how the night shift was, but she only shrugged and muttered, "We're always open," before drifting back to her magazine. I sat by the window sipping the bitter coffee. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into a mist that clung to the glass. The truck in the corner was still idling, though I hadn't seen anyone in or out of it. That was when I noticed her. She was standing near the edge of the highway, maybe 20 meters from the roadhouse sign. A young woman, slim, wearing a pale dress that clung damply to her figure. Her hair, dark and long, looked plastered to her cheek. She wasn't moving, just standing there with her arms loosely at her sides, head tilted slightly. The oddest part was the expression. Even from the window, I could see it. She was smiling faintly, not wide or exaggerated, just a small, knowing curl of the lips. I blinked and looked down at my coffee, then back out. She hadn't moved. Something about the way the mist swirled around her made it hard to judge distance, like she might have been much closer than I thought. I asked the woman behind the counter, "Hey, do you see that girl out there?" She didn't even glance up. "Finish your coffee, love. Don't pay attention to things on the highway." Her tone was sharp enough that I didn't press it. When I stepped back outside to fuel up, the mist wrapped around me, cool and damp, and for a moment I couldn't see more than a few meters. The air smelled of wet asphalt and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. I turned toward the sign, empty. The woman was gone. I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe I'd imagined her just tired from the long drive. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and checked my mirrors. That was when I froze. She was sitting in the back seat. Her pale dress was soaked, clinging to her frame. Her head was tilted, resting against the glass, hair matted to the window. She didn't speak, didn't move, just smiled faintly. The exact same smile I'd seen from the road. My chest tightened, my hands trembling against the steering wheel. I spun around, heart hammering, but the seat was empty. Nothing, just my old jacket crumpled in the corner. I sat there for a long minute, breathing hard, trying to tell myself I was exhausted, that my brain had conjured her from the fog. Finally, I shifted into drive and pulled back onto the highway. The drizzle turned into steady rain, drumming on the roof as I picked up speed. For a while everything was fine. The white lines flicked past, the wipers squeaked rhythmically, and the road stretched into darkness. Then, maybe 20 kilometers north, my rearview mirror caught something, a shape, in the back seat. I only glanced, half a second, but it was her. That same wet hair, that faint smile. This time I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes locked on the road, knuckles white on the wheel. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the rain. I whispered to myself, "She's not there. She's not there." I drove like that for another hour, too terrified to stop, until the lights of Kempsey finally glowed ahead. I pulled into a service station, nearly stumbling as I got out. I yanked the back door open. Empty again, just my jacket. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the motel lamp burning, staring at the door, waiting for the faint smile to appear in the corner of the room. Truckers say the scary part isn't when she disappears, it's when she doesn't. I think I understand now, because sometimes, driving that stretch, I still catch her in the mirror. Not every time, but often enough. And one of these nights, I'm afraid she won't vanish at all.